When it comes to Jung, people tend to be aware of his theory on the collective unconscious, synchronicity, and archetypes. But what people may not be familiar with is that almost all of his major theoretical formulations were influenced by, and in some cases may even have taken their origin from, his attempts to come to terms with his experiences, observations, and studies of paranormal phenomena. Once, in March 1909, the tension between Freud and Jung resulted in an argument that had both an interesting psychological context and an even more interesting parapsychological outcome. Earlier in the evening, Freud had, as he afterwards wrote in a letter to Jung, formally adopted you as an eldest son, anointing you as my successor and crown prince. Later in the evening, however, in the course of an argument about paranormal phenomena, a seemingly unaccountable detonation went off in Freud's bookcase. When Freud dismissed Jung's parapsychological interpretation of the event, Jung predicted that the same thing would happen again, and so, to Freud's consternation, it did. Freud's letter to Jung continues by remarking of this phenomenon, by which he admitted to having been impressed that it, then and there, i.e. immediately after his anointing of Jung, divested me of my paternal dignity. Whether or not consciously realized at the time, this incident symbolized the inevitable divergence between the two psychologists. One of the main causes of this divergence was the significance each attached to paranormal phenomena. Jung's paranormal experiences and the resulting need adequately to understand them were probably the greatest influence on the development of his theory of synchronicity. Jung's specific interest in meaningful coincidence or synchronicity dates from the mid-1920s when, as he says, I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious and kept coming across connections which I could not explain as chance groupings or runs. What I found were coincidences which were connected so meaningfully that their chance concurrence would represent a degree of improbability that would have to be expressed by an astronomical figure. As a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I have often come up against the phenomena in question and could convince myself how much these inner experiences meant to my patients. In most cases, they were things which people do not talk about for fear of exposing themselves to thoughtless ridicule. I was amazed to see how many people have had experiences of this kind, and how carefully the secret was guarded. The meaning which coincidences had for their subject, including their attendant emotional charge, or numinosity, seemed to stem from the underlying presence of an archetype, activated usually in response to the person having reached some kind of psychological impasse. Coincidences can be symbolic in their meaning. In November 1928, Jung is recorded as having used the words synchronize and synchronism. A year later, on December 4, 1929, another incident occurred. The 5-year-old child of one of the participants in a seminar made 2 drawings incorporating symbols, principally the cross and the crescent, that were being talked about. Yet the child had not actually been exposed to any information about the seminars. Jung remarks, since I have seen many other examples of the same kind, in which people not concerned were affected, I have invented the word synchronicity as a term to cover these phenomena. That is, things happening at the same time moment as an expression of the same time content. In a letter dated September 6, 1947, Jung can be quoted as saying, in cases of difficult psychological diagnosis, I usually get a horoscope in order to have a further point of view from an entirely different angle. I must say that I very often found that the astrological data elucidated certain points which I otherwise would have been unable to understand. This practical involvement provided Jung with data which seemed to support the idea of moments of time having particular qualities. The fact that astrology nevertheless yields valid results proves that it is not the apparent positions of the stars which work, but rather the times which are measured or determined by arbitrarily named stellar positions. Time thus proves to be a stream of energy filled with qualities and not, as our philosophy would have it, an abstract concept or precondition of knowledge. Around 1920, Jung began experimenting with the ancient Chinese oracle system of the I Ching, or Book of Changes, and was deeply impressed by its effectiveness in yielding pertinent answers to his questions. He relates how, one summer he resolved to make an all-out attack on the riddle of this book. I would sit for hours on the ground beneath the 100-year-old pear tree, the I Ching beside me, practicing the technique by referring the resultant oracles to one another in an interplay of questions and answers. All sorts of undeniably remarkable results emerge, meaningful connections with my own thought processes which I could not explain to myself. Time and again, I encountered amazing coincidences which seemed to suggest the idea of an acausal parallelism, a synchronicity as I later call it. Synchronicity takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than mere chance, namely, a peculiar interdependence of objective events among themselves, as well as with the subjective psychic states of the observer or observers. Jung believed that knowledge of events at a distance or in the future is possible because, within the unconscious psyche, all events coexist timelessly and spacelessly. For the unconscious psyche, space and time seem to be relative. That is to say, knowledge finds itself in a space-time continuum in which space is no longer space, nor time time. If, therefore, the unconscious should develop or maintain a potential in the direction of consciousness, it is then possible for parallel events to be perceived or known. Under certain psychic conditions, time and space can both become relative and can appear to be transcended altogether. The fact that Rhine's positive results fell off once his subjects began to lose interest suggests to Jung that the necessary psychic condition has to do with affectivity. As the energy of consciousness is lowered, the energy of the unconscious is correspondingly heightened, so that a gradient from the unconscious to the conscious is established, and unconscious contents flow into consciousness more readily than usual. In his 1951 Aranos lecture, Jung offers a definition which he recognizes three categories of events to which the term synchronicity can be applied. The first category includes such happenings as the scarab incident, where a psychic event, the patient's recalling her dream of a scarab, and the physical event, the actual appearance of a scarabid beetle, occur at the same time and in the same place during the analytic session in Jung's consulting room. Here there is, indeed, simultaneity between the psyche and the physical events. The second category includes happenings where a psychic event occurs and a corresponding physical event takes place more or less simultaneously, but at a distance, so that the approximate simultaneity can only be established afterwards. Jung cites as an illustration Emanuel Swedenborg's well-attested vision of the Great Fire in Stockholm in 1759. Swedenborg was at a party in Gothenburg about 200 miles from Stockholm when the vision occurred. He told his companions at 6 o'clock in the evening that the fire had started, then described its course over the next 2 hours, exclaiming in relief at 8 o'clock that it had at last been extinguished, just 3 doors from his own house. All these details were confirmed when messengers arrived in Gothenburg from Stockholm over the next few days. The third category includes happenings where a psychic event occurs and a corresponding physical event takes place in the future. Here there is not even approximate simultaneity. An example mentioned by Jung is of a student friend of his whose father had promised him a trip to Spain if he passed his final examinations satisfactorily. The friend then had a dream of seeing various things in a Spanish city, a particular square, a Gothic cathedral, and, around a certain corner, a carriage drawn by 2 cream-colored horses. Shortly afterwards, having successfully passed his examinations, he actually visited Spain for the first time, and encountered all the details from his dream in reality. Jung's personal paranormal experiences confronted him with events which seemed inexplicable in terms of normal physical and psychological causes. There was, for example, no apparent cause of the walnut table splitting or the bread knife shattering in a closed drawer. The impression Jung gained from events such as these that normal causality was insufficient as a comprehensive principle of explanation was later reinforced by the results of Rhine's experiments. Since experience, i.e., Rhine's experimental work, has shown that under certain conditions, space and time can be reduced almost to zero, causality disappears along with them, because causality is bound up with the existence of space and time and physical changes, and consists essentially in the succession of cause and effect. For this reason, synchronistic phenomena cannot in principle be associated with any conception of causality. Hence, the interconnection of meaningfully coincident factors must necessarily be thought of as acausal. The philosophical principle that underlies our conception of natural law is causality, but if the connection between cause and effect turns out to be only statistically valid and only relatively true, then the causal principle is only of relative use for explaining natural processes and therefore presupposes the existence of one or more other factors which would be necessary for an explanation. Rather surprisingly, Jung nowhere sets out systematically his thoughts concerning what actually makes synchronicities meaningful. He does, however, provide a substantial clue to his implicit understanding when he states that, by far the greatest number of synchronistic phenomena that I have had occasion to observe and analyze can easily be shown to have a direct connection with the archetype. Though he appears to recognize not one but several kinds of meaning that can adhere to synchronicities, all of these can ultimately be related back to the single factor of the archetype. Aziz, for example, has identified 4 levels of meaning referred to by Jung at different times. These are 1. Simply the fact of 2 or more events paralleling one another. The paralleling is by virtue of a shared content or meaning. 2. The emotional charge or numinosity attending the synchronicity, a source of non-rational meaning. 3. The significance of the synchronicity interpreted subjectively from the point of view of the experiencer's personal needs and goals. And 4. The significance of the synchronicity objectively as the expression of an archetypal meaning which is transcendental to human consciousness. Thus in synchronicities, one and the same transcendental meaning might manifest itself simultaneously in the human psyche and in the arrangement of an external and independent event. The relationship between mind and body is a source of unending perplexity for physicians, psychologists, and philosophers alike. Jung states a version of the problem as follows. The assumption of a causal relation between psyche and physis leads to conclusions which it is difficult to square with experience. Either there are physical processes which cause psychic happenings, or there is a pre-existent psyche which organizes matter. In the first case, it is hard to see how chemical processes can ever produce psychic processes, and in the second case, one wonders how an immaterial psyche could ever set matter in motion. Either there is some other nervous substrate in us apart from the cerebrum that can think and perceive, or else the psychic processes that go on in us during loss of consciousness are synchronistic phenomena, i.e., events which have no causal connection with organic processes. The psyche and the body should be viewed as different manifestations of a single energy, and their relationship be understood in terms of the transformation of this energy into greater or lesser states of intensification. At the most fundamental level, synchronicity led Jung to speculate about the nature of reality. The fact, for instance, that in synchronistic events the same archetypal pattern of meaning seems capable of expressing itself independently in both psychic and physical contexts suggested to him that all reality may be grounded on an as yet unknown substrate, possessing material and at the same time psychic qualities. The synchronistic principle suggests that there is an interconnection or unity of causally unrelated events, and thus postulates a unitary aspect of being which can very well be described as the unus mundus. This postulated unitary background to existence, in which the concepts of psyche and matter and space and time merge into a psychophysical space-time continuum, was where Jung considered the archetypes themselves, as opposed to their phenomenal manifestations, ultimately to be located. To express this ambivalent nature, at once psychic and physical, yet neither, because beyond both, he was led to coin the term psychoid. The ability of the archetype to manifest synchronistically its independent psychic and physical context is itself an indicator of its fundamentally psychoid nature. On the personal level, Jung's own visionary experiences of union, which attended his near-fatal illness in 1944, can also be understood in the light of synchronicity. Although he does not himself directly apply the concept of synchronicity to these experiences, his characterization of them in terms of a quality of absolute objectivity and of a non-temporal state in which present, past, and future are one clearly reflects the absolute knowledge and space-time relativity involved in synchronicities. In fact, his sense of his visions as representing a kind of mystic marriage between self and world, the hierogosmos or mysterium connectionitis, suggests that they may actually constitute an experiential realization of the unitary dimension of existence, the unus mundus, towards which he considers the more familiar forms of synchronicity to be pointing. Jung is more explicit concerning the implications of synchronicity for the question of possible life after death. For epistemological reasons, he does not think one can actually prove that there is survival of death, but he considers it significant that the unconscious psyches of people approaching death generally present dreams and other spontaneous imagery which imply an expected continuity. The hint provided by this is supported by two different aspects of synchronicity. On a general level, he argues that the space-time relativization involved in synchronicity implies that the psyche exists in a continuum outside time and space. Although we do not know in detail what existence outside time is like, we can at least infer that it is outside change and possesses relative eternity. Jung sometimes refers to synchronistic events as miracles, though it is clear that he does so only in a loose way and certainly without any expectation of having to provide theological backing for his usage. Occasionally, however, he does address the issue of traditionally designated religious miracles, and on these occasions sometimes refers to synchronicity. Thus, speaking of the identity of Christ, the empirical man, with the traditional Son of Man type, he says, wherever such identities occur, characteristic archetypal effects appear, that is, numinosity and synchronistic phenomena. Hence, tales of miracles are inseparable from the Christ figure. At other times, he suggests that explanations for apparent miracles, such as the case of Brother Claus living for 20 years without material sustenance, should be sought more specifically in the realm of parapsychology and mediumistic phenomena. Even here, however, the implication is that the sustained paranormal phenomena constituting the miracle are synchronistic archetypal effects rendered possible by the maintaining of a numinous religious attitude. Finally, Jung also had recourse to the concept of synchronicity when attempting to account for the baffling reports of UFOs. He had kept a close eye on this phenomena since its emergence in the mid-1940s and recognized that it seemed to have both a physical aspect, the fact that UFOs are not only seen but are sometimes simultaneously picked up on radar, and a psychic aspect, the fact that they provoked, like nothing else, conscious and unconscious fantasies. He was unable to decide, however, which was primary, whether there were indeed physical events followed by the fantasies, or whether the fantasies and visions were arising independently from an activated archetype. In this perplexity, he invoked synchronicity as a third possibility, suggesting that there may indeed be an anomalous physical phenomena involved, but that this meaningfully coincides with, rather than causes, the accompanying fantasies or myth-making, which has its own independent reasons for surfacing at this time. These examples should suffice to indicate how Jung's theory of synchronicity can provide, if not conclusive explanations, at least some stimulating new perspectives on a wide range of anomalous phenomena. The theory of synchronicity brings more fully into awareness the experiential reality, the complexity, and above all, the potential meaningfulness of paranormal events. In doing so, it perhaps furthers what Jung once described as the uncomprehended purpose of any nocturnal, numinous experience. to make us feel the overpowering presence of a mystery, shaking our certitudes and lending wings to the imagination.